Hi, everyone. So this is a video about theodicy, which is the technical term for the problem of evil or the problem of suffering, specifically how to reconcile either of these categories with the existence of God. So in the classical form of this problem, people ask, if God is all good and all powerful, how can there be evil or suffering in the world? Well, that's the Christian way of framing the problem. The problem is different, of course, in Eastern non-dualist spiritual traditions because there is no God as supernatural, superhuman being overlooking things who could intervene but chooses not to. That's not the issue when we're looking at the theology and philosophy of these Eastern non-dualist traditions. Nonetheless, there's still a problem of theodicy. And for example, if the tradition says nothing exists which is not Shiva, which can be interpreted to say everything is God, then of course people ask the question, oh, wait a second, so you're saying war is God and rape is God and genocide is God. If everything is God, then those things must be God too, and they feel offended by this proposition and upset by it and either reject the philosophy as they understand it, or else they ask for some satisfying explanation, hoping for, some other way of looking at this. And there are, of course, other ways of looking at this. So I want to share something I wrote to somebody who raised this objection a couple of years back. And this person said, as many people do, I can't believe that God caused the Holocaust, right? You say God is the cause of everything, or you say divine consciousness is the cause and substance of everything. And I can't believe that that indeed could be true with relation to something as horrific as genocide. So there's no simple, quick, and easy answer to that sort of question because we have to go deeper and deeper into what we mean by God and what we mean by non-duality if we're going to even attempt to answer this question. And for that matter, we have to come to understand more clearly what we mean by terms like evil and suffering. So uh, in response to this person who raised these questions, this person being a philosopher and a theologian, I wrote to him a long and detailed response, and I addressed some of the specific things that he said. Um, so I'm just gonna read what I wrote and hope it will be useful for you. And at the very least, it will trigger a profound contemplation of deeper ways to understand these very challenging issues, very naughty issues. Knotty, obviously. So please consider and contemplate this teaching I'm about to share. First off, let me mention that I've already put an explanation of this problem in Tantra Illuminated, and you should read that passage, the passage on theodicy in Tantra Illuminated, um, to have a deeper understanding of this. But here in these comments, I'll go even deeper than I did in that passage. Okay, this is what I wrote to this friend of mine. This is the toughest thing to grapple with, for sure, the toughest nut in the non-dual view, and working with it can be profoundly beneficial. Like many people, you seem to superimpose some Western monotheistic ideas onto this non-dual, monistic, idealistic spiritual tradition, that is to say, Tantric Shaivism. For example, you say, I do not believe it is true that God caused the Holocaust, but there is no question of cause here. In non-dual Shaiva Tantra, there is no divine person causing things or choosing things. There is no consciousness distinct from that which is, which could exist in a cause and effect relationship to it. So, from the perspective of some Western dualistic monotheists, one might almost say that this is an atheistic view. Almost. More on that later. Now, also, the second misunderstanding that Westerners tend to bring to this view is the misunderstanding of associating will with personhood, as when you say, quote, there is either more than one will here, or else that single monistic will must be psychotic, unquote. Well, this makes sense only in the context of an imagined divine person to whom the universal will that manifests reality belongs. But the cause of what is, if you must think in terms of cause, and you needn't, by the way, in this view, is not so much the will, but rather the autonomy of consciousness, swatantriya shakti. This autonomy is total openness to all possibilities, even pain and suffering. It's a radically wide open playing field where ignorance, or self-forgetting, and pain can express as fully as self-awareness and love. Because what would be the alternative to this total autonomy, this open playing field? It could only be a universe in which ignorance and pain were disallowed. But if you think about it in any depth, you will realize that such a universe would only be possible if we humans were nothing but meat robots executing our creator's programming, totally bereft of any vestige of free will whatsoever or independent thought. As C.S. Lewis so insightfully put it, try to exclude the possibility of suffering, which the order of nature and the existence of free will involves, and you will find that you have excluded life itself. Or as Anthony Burgess put it, take away a human's power to choose, and he ceases to be human. Now, we needn't get into debates about free will here. Instead of the word choose in the second quote, we could simply speak of the conscious agent's ability to express him or herself, the ability to act on his fear and pain, or act on his compassion and love. Would you have a universe in which the former but not the latter was disallowed? A universe of essentially unconscious meat robots instead of human beings. Is that universe better than the one we have? Just one more verbal footnote about free will. Even if you deny the existence of free will in the sense of, oh, I chose A, but I could have chosen B, there's no problem here with that because we do choose, even if our choices are constrained, and we learn from our choices. And as a result of learning, we make different choices. And of course, from a neuroscience and physics deterministic point of view, you can say, well, all the choices are constrained because whether or not you were able to learn from your previous choices is also constrained. Sure, absolutely. I grant all of that. But that's not the point, because we still have the experience of choosing and the experience of learning from our choices. And that is different from this hypothetical scenario in which we don't learn, but rather execute our programming. And in the reality in which we live, where we have this possibility of learning, there also must be the possibility of making mistakes, having misunderstandings, and that includes then the possibility of what we call suffering or evil. Now, you might believe that evil is a real thing that comes not from God, but from his flawed mortal creatures, whose consciousness overlaps with God's, but is not identical to it. And this indeed is a common view that's, of course, different from the non-dualist view. But the problem with such a view, apart from postulating an unverifiable, imagined divine person, is that it has the more serious consequence of demonizing those who cause pain and thereby prevents or lessens the compassion we might feel for them. And I would argue we need to feel for them to be fully in touch with our true humanity. What if instead of recoiling in knee-jerk horror and labeling the person who's willing to torture or kill someone else as evil, you take a moment and rather imagine the fear and pain that must be living in a human heart to make such actions seem reasonable to him or her? Can you even begin to imagine the pain and darkness within a human unable to access his or her innate capacity for love, tolerance, and forgiveness? If you can begin to imagine it, you weep tears of compassion for the one doing the torturing as well as the one being tortured. Haven't you ever beat yourself up, treated yourself badly, hated yourself? Seeing from the non-dual perspective, I view that the same as I view one human being hating another and beating another, because for me, there is no other. So you hating on yourself, beating yourself up, even let's say cutting yourself, self-harming, that is experienced in my body as exactly the same as one human cutting another. I don't see the difference there that others do. Of course, in either situation, it's tragic. It's the one harming itself. It's the tragedy of the one hurting itself in a moment of terrible misunderstanding. That misunderstanding is possible because in this open playing field, each expression of the one cannot be forced to understand itself, cannot be forced to access its deepest true nature. That has to be a possibility, not a program. For if it were the latter, it wouldn't be real self-understanding at all, but merely the simulation thereof. So when you see from a non-dual perspective, you don't see victim versus perpetrator, or rather, you can see that everyone is a victim and everyone is simultaneously a perpetrator. If you need those categories, they always both apply, but you can also be free of the categories and still grieve that tragic misunderstanding that results in the one harming itself. Third example. You demonstrate that you don't yet understand the non-dual interpretation of the five acts, that is to say, the Panchakritya: emanation, sustenance, dissolution, concealment, and revelation. For you imagine that causing pain would be considered an expression of the third act, saying the retraction or dissolution of the created should not be confused with deliberately inflicting suffering, but it is not the third act. Rather, causing pain, inflicting suffering, is an expression of the fourth act, that of self-forgetting or self-concealment. A human who is alienated from himself or herself, unable to access his own core, unable to even taste the unconditional loving presence that is his real being, and who is wholly identified with his social persona and its desperate fear, based in an unconscious perception of its meaninglessness and unreality. Such a being is the one in full self-concealment, and for such a being, it is natural to lash out and hurt others. When he successfully hurts others, then at least he has company. Misery loves company. It's true. And if she or he has to be miserably contracted, why should not others feel the same? That's their view. If you were self-concealed to that degree, you would also find it natural to hurt others, whether or not you were able to restrain that impulse. So can you let yourself feel compassion for those so cut off from their own self? Fourth example. My interlocutor wrote, I do not believe that this poor man who died of his injuries was responsible for his suffering, referring to the case of a Dalit individual in India who was beat up and killed by racist individuals or casteist individuals. So my interlocutor says, I don't believe he was responsible for his own suffering. My response is, the NST view does not claim that he is responsible or that he deserves it, nor does it claim the opposite. It claims that this is the wrong way to think about it. No one is to blame unless you want to blame the whole universe, because everything about the setup, from our biology to our social constructs to the autonomous nature of consciousness, makes possible incidents such as this. Indeed, it makes them unavoidable. That makes them no less worthy of grief. And if you have clear seeing, you will grieve the Dalit man's suffering and you will grieve his killer's suffering. If you cannot do the latter, you run the risk of becoming like him. As when Sapolsky imagines torturing Hitler, imagining that justice is served by visiting upon him what he visited upon others, until he, Sapolsky, realized that he is behaving indistinguishably from Hitler. When you hate the hater, you approach that point. As a student of mine perfectly put it, quote, I don't view the smallest infraction of stepping on another's dignity while trying to get what I want as fundamentally different from the most egregious of human atrocities. And I think to do so is dangerous. Fifth example, you say, I don't believe this was part of a honing process perfectly calibrated to eventually center him in his unconditional freedom and love. Well, this objection applies more to modern New Age religion than to Tantric Shaivism. But also, this is the shift from the first to the third person that always misses the point, spiritually speaking. Nobody's claiming that this event was so calibrated. It's not a third person claim. If you're the one reading the news, hearing about terrible things, you are the one hurting, you are the one contemplating this. That is what's part of a honing process perfectly calibrated to center you in your unconditional freedom and love. So do you see the point? we can't say this is true from a third person perspective. We cannot say that this is true for somebody else. We can only say that it's true for you. Once the awakening process has begun, whatever you confront moment to moment, day to day, can indeed be part of a honing process perfectly calibrated to center you in your unconditional freedom and love. So you can only apply this teaching to yourself, not to third parties. Think about it, feel through it, see for yourself if that's true. Sixth example, you say that in the monistic view, social justice movements are undermined or don't make sense because, quote, by trying to change anything, we would be working against God's divine play, unquote. But as a student of mine suggested, this demonstrates a non-understanding of the non-dual view. Precisely because you are not separate from the whole, your desire to change things in such a way as to ameliorate human suffering, a desire I share, by the way, is precisely part of that divine play. And to resist that desire is to struggle against what is. Also, consider these profound quotes from C.S. Lewis on the importance of distinguishing kindness from love. Kindness cares not whether its object becomes good or bad, provided only that it escapes suffering. Here, kindness is what some people these days call idiot compassion. While love, true love, divine love, would rather see the loved ones suffer much than be happy in contemptible and estranging modes that estrange them from their true nature. Second quote, love in its own nature demands the perfecting of the beloved, that the mere kindness which tolerates anything except suffering in its object is, in that respect, at the opposite pole from love. So the point of these quotes is that love does not want a lack of suffering from those that are loved, for those that are loved. It wants something deeper. Growth, freedom, openness, connection, divine union. Whereas idiot compassion just wants people to be free of suffering. Well, if we plugged everyone in the world into a VR game that gave you endless pleasure, so that everyone just, grinned happily while drooling on themselves, pissing themselves, we could say they're free of suffering. But something deep inside us rebels against that hypothetical possibility for good reason. And the point of the thought experiment is to show that mere freedom from suffering is insufficient and that we don't truly want that for those we love. Therefore, suffering has to be part of the equation to bring about deeper possibilities of human growth. I need to stress one more point more strongly about surrender. How telling is it that when people consider the injunction to surrender to what is, they imagine themselves as standing apart and separate from what is. They imagine that surrender is passive acceptance of everything outside of themselves. Well, that idea has nothing to do with non-dual surrender to what is, which by definition must include surrender to that which wants to come through you. Surrender to your impulse to work for change, if you have such an impulse. Surrender to your desire to relieve suffering, if you can, if you have such a desire. How telling it is that when you picture God's play, you imagine yourself standing outside of it, thinking, by trying to change anything, I would be working against God's play. How could you, your desires, your pain, and your compassion included, not be a part of the divine play, if there is one? And by the way, when we speak of divine play, we use that word precisely because it can mean both drama and game. So think about it. If you stand outside the play, then so does everyone else from their own perspective, in which case there is no play. So was Martin Luther King Jr. working against God's play when he engaged in civil disobedience to end apartheid in the American South? Of course not. That was the play. And the white men filled with rage and fear who beat MLK's allies were actors in the same play. Was Gandhi working against God's play when he tirelessly worked to nonviolently end British rule? Could anyone possibly do anything but act their part in the play? No, the only questions are whether you play your part fully or half-heartedly, and whether you awaken from the dream that you are your character, as opposed to the one actor. Whether you awaken to yourself as the actor, the capital A, the one actor who plays all the characters, but who is none of the characters, or equally all of them, and the sky and earth and grass and everything else just as much. None of this makes any sense if you conceptualize God's play as something a divine person is orchestrating, like a puppeteer. That puppeteer would indeed be psychotic, but there is no puppeteer, no overseer, no ordainer here. So there being no person up there in this view, no possessor of the consciousness that is all, just as there is in truth no possessor of your consciousness, we might as well replace the word God with something else. I like the phrase, the pattern. The pattern includes the ebb and flow of the tides, the ebb and flow of human behavior. All the ebbs and flows, all the fluxes in all their various modes of understanding and lack thereof, of concealment and revelation, of self-abnegation and self-realization. But what does it really mean, this non-dual Shiva Tantra teaching that Shiva is the agent of all actions, the one actor? In the end, it's not a theistic teaching about a psychotic or schizophrenic divine person who equally wants to hurt and heal. Who would subscribe to that view? No, no. Rather, it's a metaphor. There is one consciousness, which doesn't mean one person, since personhood is wholly a socio-cultural construct. But it's true that everything I've said so far is an intellectual or conceptual explanation, true pointers carefully considered, but not the true pointers carefully considered, but not the truth in and of itself, which is, of course, inexpressible. So in conclusion, let me try to share from a more personal level, from that which I have seen, not thought, but simply seen to be true, in the same way that you see there's a computer or a phone in front of me right now. So this is the sharing from my own experience. One can easily see the pattern of existence as implacable, relentless, unfeeling. And in a way, it is. But if you allow me to speak metaphorically, because really there are no words for this, I would say that when awakening penetrates to a deeper level, you realize that the motive force of the pattern is, in a sense, something like love. Nothing like what most people mean by the word love, perhaps. Nothing like this possessive, compulsive, distorting emotional clinging. Something much quieter, much deeper, much more sublime, much more incomprehensible, that we could call divine love. And I would say everything happens ultimately because of this love. The shining of the sun, the falling of the rain, the toil of women and men. Everything in human life happens because of love, its presence or its perceived absence. Its presence moves humans to do miraculous deeds to achieve what seems impossible, and its absence is so horrifying, so painful, that humans enduring that absence are capable of great horror, especially if their alienation is so great that they have decided love is not real. For if that were true, then nothing forestalls their impulse to destroy whatever or whoever stands in the way of their slightest chance at some simulacrum of happiness. And nothing forestalls their impulse to make others share their pain in a twisted simulation of human connection, in which they say, "Oh, yeah? Does it hurt? Well, now you know how it feels to be me." This is another way of talking about there being one consciousness, one actor behind all actions. Again, not a person, but a power, a force. Whether we call it love or connection or something else, there is one motive force in human behavior and in the whole universe, in fact. That which moves all things. Instinctively, we want to experience that, to be connected to that fundamental force so much that if we have even a tiny crumb of it, we'll do almost anything to protect and preserve that crumb. And if we don't, we'll do almost anything to get it if we believe it's possible. And if we don't believe it's possible, there's nothing much to do except watch the world burn and maybe throw some fuel on the fire. All these things, we crave for the same reason: the recognition and validation of our peers, the approval of our parents and teachers, to be sexually desired by someone we desire, to be seen and understood by those who matter to us, to be in on the joke, to be on the same wavelength as the other person, and countless other examples. All these things we crave for the fleeting flavor of connection that they offer. But none of it ever fully satisfies because it's all an ephemeral stand-in for the real deal. Full experiential realization of the ever-present, total, complete connection and all-encompassing love that always is and couldn't ever not be. Connection so total that the very word is a mockery of it. And the binding agent of that universal total connection in perfect infinite interdependence is what I'm calling love, transcendent love, And it's only because of love that connection is, and ultimately everything is. Without it, atoms wouldn't bind together, let alone anything else. This ultimate truth is constantly staring us in the face with such obviousness. And yet we can't deeply, properly get it until we do. And the pain of not getting it, of seeing and feeling things as opposite from how they actually are, is so great that it's a goddamn miracle that anyone manages to be decent to anyone else prior to awakening to this truth I'm talking about, this reality. Whether or not they are aware of it, usually not, except partially, everyone is suffering horribly until clear seeing dawns and awakeness matures. Everyone is suffering horribly until clear seeing dawns and awakeness matures, whether they show it or not, whether they admit to it or not. We don't talk about it much because it's a major downer to digest, but it's true. Almost everyone, except those who have stabilized in their true nature, which is clearly a tiny, 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 tiny percentage of those on this earth, everyone else is suffering so consistently, they don't even realize their default state is suffering a lot of the time. In the context of the enormity of that suffering, every single act of human kindness or love or decency is a total fucking miracle. It's miraculous that love is so powerful that it shines through all that, and humans actually manage to glimpse each other sometimes, sense each other, touch each other, even in the midst of their fog of confusion and pain. In conclusion, you asked whether evil acts committed by severely contracted spirits would be rejected by the full light of consciousness. And you imagine that they are rejected by the full light of consciousness. And this statement grieves me, for I want so much for you and everyone to see that if they were rejected, if anything was rejected, it would not and could not exist. Nothing is rejected by the full light of consciousness, or else it wouldn't be. And no one ever in the whole history of mankind is unworthy of love, even those committing these evil acts. Love is not approval. Love is not passivity. If I had been there that day that the Dalit man was beaten and killed, I would have attempted to intervene, even at risk of injury to myself. And even though I know there's no such thing as an innocent victim any more than there is such thing as an evil perpetrator who's not also a victim, still, I would have tried to intervene for exactly the same reason. I lovingly coach those who hate themselves out of their confusion as best I can, because it's my nature to do so. It's my nature to stop a child running into traffic. It's my nature to tell someone uttering racist slurs, hey, that's not okay. Even though I know that ultimately everything is okay and more than okay. It's beautiful. And I don't need to hate the racist person in order to intervene. I don't need to believe that they should be different. I don't need to dehumanize them or demonize them. It's my nature to make a plea on behalf of love and tolerance. And to do so, I don't need to imagine that anything has gone wrong or should be different. All I need to know is that it feels right to intervene, and I can do so while loving all involved. Do you think that person might feel a difference if I intervene out of love rather than hatred for the perceived perpetrator? Do you think they might feel that? Contrariwise, do you think that rejecting and hating the perceived perpetrator somehow helps anything? So here we're just dipping our toes in a very long conversation about the nature of reality. Practical philosophers have had this conversation countless times in countless places under countless different names. And we're going to keep having it until the light of real understanding dawns. Om.